We're broadcasting live from KPMG's headquarters in Johannesburg this morning, and where we're going to be taking the pulse of African emerging markets. Now, many African emerging markets have proven over the last several years to be attractive investment destinations, and with that has come a changing perception of investment risk versus opportunity. Today, that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking. But before I introduce you to my panel of guests that's going to help us do just that today, I'm going to introduce Moses Khosana, who's Chairman and Senior Partner of KPMG Africa and CE of KPMG South Africa. And he's going to help set the scene for what is the first of a four-part series on African investment climate and investment opportunities. Moses, let's hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alishia. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to welcome you to KPMG Africa Conversation Series. This is the first of many that we'll be holding. But firstly, let me welcome you, our audience who are here in person in KPMG. I'd like to welcome our panelists who took the time to join us this morning. But more importantly, our viewers throughout the Africa continent who are watching through the CNBC Africa, and I'd like to thank you, Alishia, for organizing that for our viewers out there. And Josphat, one of our colleagues in East Africa, welcome to you as well. Well, KPMG launched the conversation in 2009 already. Our intention is to foster interaction between our clients, our KPMG experts, and business out there who are actually operating in various economies in Africa. We've already done a few so far. The first one we had was on regulatory environment, just to find out what is the impact on regulatory on business. We also held another conversation on the FIFA 2010 World Cup in South Africa, just to find out what was the economic impact on SMMEs and businesses out at large. And the last one we held last year was also on climate change. Well, we do this to share knowledge and foster interaction between our clients and experts, as I said. Well, we decided to hold this KPMG Africa conversation. Why do we do that? Firstly, we know that the international world out there, coming out of the global recession, their growth is very low. But we know that Africa is forecast to be growing much higher than the global economies out there. And therefore, there is an interest in the opportunities that are in Sub-Sahara and the African continent. We know that the BBC is forecasting that Africa Sub-Sahara will be growing by 5.3% in 2011, and economies like Angola and Nigeria will be growing up to 7%. Therefore, there is a tremendous interest in the African economy, and that's why we're holding these conversations. Secondly, we know that there is a lot of international interest in Africa. The Chinese are investing in Africa. The Indians have done lots of investment. There are lots of multinationals who have already invested in Africa. And we also know that the private equity houses out there in the US, elsewhere in the country, in the world, are investing in the continent. Therefore, there is a tremendous opportunity. But we also believe that professional firms like ourselves have got a tremendous opportunity to share with clients on how to invest in Africa, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, what are the complexities that you need to be looking after before you invest here. So we believe Africa is a continent whose time has come. And KPMG is well represented throughout the continent, from Cape to Cairo. Our professionals are there to help clients who want to invest in the continent. So I would like you to enjoy the conversations that our panels are going to be sharing with us, and have fun, and let's interact. And thank you very much, Alishia.
Thank you very much, Moses. We're going to be getting straight into this conversation now, and that's with Lullu Krugel. She's a senior economist at KPMG. Oti Ikomi, who's senior vice president of Ecobank Transnational. Nicolas Maweni, marketing and communications specialist. And then joining us live from our studios in Nairobi, Kenya as well is Josphat Mwaura. He's managing partner at KPMG East Africa. So welcome to you all. And Lulu, I'm going to start off with you. When it comes to Africa as a global business destination of choice, we've got Africa often lumped together in comparison with other emerging markets like China and India. And the point to be made is that we're not looking at a country. We're looking at a continent. Let's get straight into breaking this mold at this stage. How would you describe the African economic landscape?
Well, there's a lot that has happened. Moses already mentioned the growth that we've seen and the growth that's projected for this year of over 5%, which is, I mean, if you compare it to what's happening in the rest of the world, really attractive for investors. But there's some other trends that have emerged over the last couple of years. For example, we've seen productivity picking up significantly. We've moved from an environment where we've seen negative productivity in Africa to where we're sitting with productivity close to 3%. That's also attractive to investors, that the economies are becoming more productive. Economies in Africa are diversifying. We see resource economies starting to move away from only focusing on resources, moving to more diversified economies. And then another interesting trend over which there are mixed feelings is the trend of urbanization. There's more and more people moving into cities. That has problems of its own. If they don't get work, there's slums that develop, etc. So there is a lot of social problems around that. But that also creates a market for businesses. It's easier for a bank to go to a city to set up services there. People in cities need services that they don't necessarily need in rural areas. And in general, it's just easier to provide services in a city than it is to provide in rural areas.
Well, Oti, you've certainly had your experiences across the various borders. One would assume that you agree with Lulu, on the points she's made, where we're dealing with a myriad of operating environments, and each with their own set of rules as well.
That's very correct, Alishia. There are different environments, but the interesting angle to this is that it also creates opportunities. We see challenges from infrastructure, we see challenges from skill set, but we've taken a view that Africa, following the growth story, and particularly looking at what we call the middle of Africa, where there's been a large underrepresentation of banking services and solutions, is an area to focus on. So our organization, as well as others, have been very focused on that, and we see huge opportunities to continue to grow there.
In fact, Nicholas, I mean, in the decade between 1998 and 2008, Africa FDI into Africa quadrupled. And over the past 2 years, we've seen a taper off, but certainly not to the extent that many had anticipated it would. We've got US-based multinationals like Walmart, Coca-Cola, IBM, just a couple of the examples of companies that are looking to set up shop here and enhance their footprint. What's the appeal, as you see it, investing in Africa?
Well, thanks, Alishia. Well, there's a couple of reasons why we've noticed quite a number of the so-called multinationals jumping into Africa. Well, one is because the Europe, as well as the other parts of America, is no longer experiencing the same growth. So what's now happening is that the African continent, or rather the dark continent that everybody's always perceived it to be, is now presenting these companies with great opportunities. And in fact, a couple of the brands or companies you've mentioned, the likes of Coca-Cola. Remember, Coke is probably diminishing in sort of the much more mature markets. So they probably have great opportunities in emerging and developing markets. And the second one is the like of Walmart. Well, we know how big retail is, or rather becoming, in the rest of Africa. The big challenge for most of these guys is, do you do the copy and paste of what you've done in other parts of the world, or do you rather find African solutions that will really be relevant for the rest of Africans?
And I mean, we've got that happening, and the businesses needing to decide how they're going to embark on what kind of strategy when venturing onto the continent, Lulu. But these kinds of investments, I mean, I've highlighted IBM, Walmart, Coca-Cola, accelerating ongoing diversification that you touched on beyond just commodities and resources. We're going into retailing, telecoms, financial services. Is enough being done to diversify? And I know I'm using an umbrella term here, but the African economic base to harness more investment moving forward?
Well, KPMG's conducted a survey at the end of last year to ask some of our African clients what their views are on the factors that will attract investment to Africa. What are the things that's needed to move the African economy and the specific countries' economies forward? And there was quite a couple of interesting things that actually came out of that survey that wasn't what we actually expected to see. One thing, for example, is that clients and businesses in Africa would like to see more labor mobility, so skills being transferred between economies more easily. That's a factor that's hampering diversification in a lot of economies because they don't have the skills, the critical skills in the areas that they need to diversify to. And also the diversification, we spoke about retail, that is seen as one of the growth areas for Africa. The African population is over 1 billion. It's expected to grow to about 1.8 billion. But the point is people should have money in their pockets. And as long as the wealth is concentrated in certain sectors and certain areas, that's not necessarily going to escalate growth to the way that we would like to see it, especially in the retail sector. So that diversification of economies and seeing that there's more money in the man on the street's pocket is extremely important for the African economies to be able to move forward.
Oti, from a financial services perspective, I mean, what's your perspective on the broadening of wealth that we are seeing, where it's all on the consumer to drive this next growth agenda?
Thanks again, Alishia. There was a recent study, I believe, by McKinsey, which stated that before 2015, there's about 200 million consumers who are in the emerging class coming to the market. So you've got a scenario where you've got a broad base of consumers, expanding to the market. You've got improved diversification into industries. You've got skill sets. You've got also an enhancement of payment systems and a whole range of innovation presenting themselves in the continent. When you juxtapose all of this together, these are actually very compelling scenarios for growth and for focus on the continent.
Let's bring Josphat into this conversation at this point, because Josphat, as we've been saying, it's actually the African consumer that's getting a lot of the attention, with the growing middle class and urbanization happening to the extent that we are seeing. In East Africa, we've seen the investment climate really heating up within the telecom sector as one example. How big a draw card are markets being created by regional integration efforts that we're seeing on that end, like the East African community?
Sorry, Alishia, my sound is not very good, but I think my understanding of the question is the effects of integration on East Africa?
Yes, and just looking at a regional expansion and how that broadens the scope for businesses to tackle and tap into a growing consumer market.
Yes, I mean, East Africa probably provides one of the most attractive investment destinations in the continent right now because as you say, we've got an integrated region, 5 countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, that brings together a population of about 130 million people. And within that, there are also linkages with Eastern DRC. There are linkages with Southern Sudan, which, as you know, recently voted for independence, and there are also linkages with Ethiopia. So you're talking about a region with a very huge market, and with people positioning themselves in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and Rwanda, which has become sort of like the innovation hub of East Africa. You actually have this huge local market where even before you begin to think about export, you're talking about servicing this market, which has historical linkages, with India, with China, with what one would call the monsoon countries. So you've got markets as far as China, Pakistan, as export destinations. So when you set up in East Africa, you're not only selling to the local population, and there's a significant market in that, but you also are positioning yourself to the traditional export markets that Kenya has.
Josphat, where political risk is going to be a key consideration for some time to come, we've got Kenya's coalition government currently experiencing some strain. To what extent is this tipping the scales and sullying that positive picture?
I mean, when you look at political risk, Alishia, the political risk is a way of life in business. Wherever you are, there is going to be some degree of political risk. When you look at the Kenyan situation and possibly in many other African countries, what I believe in the business community we perhaps need to be doing more proactively is engaging in proactive identification of the issues before those issues blow up into a crisis. We saw that in Kenya in 2008 when we had our own sort of disruption of the economy, which affected all the way to Sudan and Uganda. And the business community came together in a very big way to participate in resolving that crisis. What we are seeing now is possibly perhaps opportunities again for us to engage in what I would call quiet diplomacy, engaging with the key players, and participating in resolving these situations before they blow up. Because quite honestly, when I look at the business environment in East Africa, the single biggest risk that we face is that risk of either political or social unrest. And we must do everything that is possible to stop it. I don't see that as a huge risk at the moment. The analogy I use in assessing political risk in East Africa is looking at one of our modern wonders of the world in the Masai Mara, the migration of the wildebeest. The wildebeest move because they need they need food. Now, and along the way, they know there are all the risks of hyenas, of lions, of crocodiles, of flowing rivers, and so on. But that doesn't stop them moving from year to year. And I think business have to begin to think the same way, perhaps maybe not as wildebeests, but to see the opportunities and to see the challenges as surmountable, being attracted by the significant opportunities that lie on the other side of the river, as it were, and in this case, that lie in each of the African countries.
Well, Nicolas, it's about taking cognizance of the risk. And I mean, Kenya is not alone when it comes to political challenges. We've most recently had issues in Cote d'Ivoire, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in South Africa. There's a perception of a nuanced shift in economic policy, begging the question, how sustainable economic policy is moving forward. In your opinion, as an investor, how do you go about assessing political scenarios?
Well, a couple of things. As a typical marketer, we always have the 4 Ps. And one of the Ps is that of the political stability in any territory that one enters. And the second one is that of being very, very much patient, because if you're going to get involved in Africa, you must have the patience, because it's not for the faint-hearted. And the third point is that of perseverance. You've got to persevere. Because you might think that you're dealing with the right person, and at the end, this might not be the right bloke. And lastly, there are lots of profits to be made in this continent, because often we always find most companies, they make as if they're doing this for charity. They're doing this as if it happens to be part of the social investment. And it's not. They're doing this because it makes good business sense. So those, to me, are probably one of the most important 4 Ps as a marketer in terms of how one should embark into the continent.
And Oti, we do have reform underway. I mean, in Nigeria, we've seen the recent banking sector reform. How are changing regulatory frameworks impacting a business like yours? Is change happening fast enough, or has your expansion, where you're sitting in, roughly 30 countries, moved ahead of that curve?
It's actually an interesting dynamic. The change process, particularly the financial regulatory change process in Nigeria, has actually, it came as, I think, to some people a rude shock. To others, like in my organization, it was always felt that there was a need to balance risk and reward. But we think that a number of right measures have been put in place. It has led, obviously, to a number of impairment losses across the industry, but it has also repositioned the industry quite strongly. And this element has also now moved to other territories, other sovereigns. We in Ecobank, we see ourselves as a very compliant high-level organization. So we are able to leverage best practices. We actually position ourselves as a world-class Pan-African bank. So some of these changes, some of these experiences that we see in markets like Nigeria and others, we're able to put this into bear into other jurisdictions that we're operating in.
Well, Lulu, we are at a stage now where we've got capital flows outstripping that of aid. And at the same time, we know that many African economies still depend on aid, with it making up as much as 50% of their overall budgets. How do you break that cycle so that investment flows replace that of aid as an economic booster?
Well, one of the factors that, once again, our clients have raised in the rest of Africa that they see as paramount, in which we as an African continent have not invested sufficiently, is the area of R&D. We don't see ourselves as market leaders. We don't see ourselves as innovators. We don't see ourselves necessarily as people that are doing new things. And I think that's a mindset that needs to change. Businesses that have actually, in Africa, that have said that they have adapted an R&D strategy and have actively started to invest in that, have also seen the positive impacts on their businesses. So the bottom line is you have to grow those economies, but you also have to get people involved in the economies. Up to now, unfortunately, in a lot of areas we've seen growth, but it was jobless growth. That is something that will have to be changed through proactive policy. And the only way that that can happen is if government has more money to spend, and for that they need businesses and they need tax income from those businesses as well. So I'm not suggesting you need to overtax businesses, not at all, but I mean a growing economy is a source of income for government in which they can then actively invest in the economy, in education and skills development of their people, and in R&D as well.
Josphat, as far as trade and investment issues are concerned, I mean, we've dealt with the P. Let's look at the C, which is another elephant in the room, and that's corruption. To what extent is that an issue, and is it, in your opinion, deterring investment?
Alishia, as I said, there are a number of risks that one would face in the continent, and corruption, political instability, perhaps inadequate infrastructure are some of the risks that we would face here. But to an extent, it is very, very important, I think, for us to recognize the effect of corruption, not just on investment, but on the economic climate. Because when you look at corruption, corruption steals the state revenue. So domestic revenues are reduced because people are not paying their taxes as they should, because they're taking advantage of corruption, as well as increases public expenditure, or what I would call inefficient public expenditure, expenditure which is not delivering value for money. So what would happen is that you see a government that is denied its resources, and the expenditure that it's incurring is not delivering value for money. And in the end, what then the result is that we are not creating the economic capacity that is required to increase the participation of the population. So corruption is, yes, it's a big issue that needs to be addressed, both from a business perspective as well as from a government perspective, because we keep saying that corruption takes two to tangle, and the business community themselves have to commit not to participate or to engage in any corruption, as well as supporting the initiatives. For example, right now in Kenya, we've got a process going on to strengthen the anti-corruption commission. But cooperating with those institutions so that the damages and the effects of corruption are reduced.
Nicolas, how do you deal with an issue like this from a public relations point of view?
Often I find that the word corruption is overly stated, because we've seen quite a number of companies who have been very successful. I mean, a couple of companies in the telcos, they've been very successful in Africa. And the question is, well, were they corrupt? So from the PR perspective, a couple of things. You could either hide behind facts, which is not going to get you far. What's important is perception. Do people perceive you to be corrupt? And that's the most important thing, rather than to say, well, you can check me factually, I did not engage with this. Here's a quick example. If you go to countries such as Nigeria, there you're running, let's say you're doing a press conference, you sometimes have to pay the media to come and attend the press conference. Well, the West will regard it as corrupt. You go to Russia, and they have exactly the same kind of scenario. You see, in South Africa and other parts of the world, when you have a press conference, media just arrive because they have an interest to cover your stories. So this is what it is. Maybe we need to probably produce our own books that will really fit our environment. So from a PR perspective, I think sometimes we just overrate it. We bring too much focus on the word corruption.
Well, to wrap this section up, I just want to touch very quickly on another issue. I mean, we've seen national interests, Lulu, being used to justify demands for value extraction for local economies themselves, and those voices are getting louder and louder on the continent. It's being labelled resource nationalism. To what extent do you see this as an impediment to investment flow, if at all?
Well, the interesting thing is the rest of the world is actually moving away from that trend. So the signals that we're sending to investors are sometimes a bit confusing. I think we need to be very careful. Nicolas mentioned perceptions, and perceptions is extremely important in this environment. If you are going to send mixed messages to investors, and if you are going to confuse them, they will think twice before they invest in a country.
Oti, from a business perspective, what's your take on how governments can adopt more progressive policies while at the same time addressing past imbalances? Because that's the issue that we're facing here.
You look at a situation in the continent of Africa where there's been a lot of legacy challenges, but we're coming to a point now where there's improved democratization, there's improved political structures emanating, despite it and albeit the challenges. You're also seeing the growth of a more viral private sector in a number of these countries. So governments need to be hopefully, expectedly, more listening, more interactive with business and with society. And I think all at a very macro level, the situation is showing progress. Mm-hmm. But one of the fundamental things for the African continent is that we have to continue to move forward. I like to quote Mr. Arnold Ekpe, the CEO of Ecobank. The world is not owing Africa a favor. We are the ones that have to continue to move forward. Then despite all of the growth indications, we have a whole lot more to do. But there's progress.
Josphat, just looking at where China fits into all of this, I mean, we talk about governments taking active steps to balance national interests with creating investment opportunities, and we see China coming in and trying to secure resources for its development as well. From your perspective, how does government handle this, competing interests?
At the end of the day, what we are looking for is to increase economic activity in the region, in the continent, and that economic activity is going to benefit the people and is going to benefit the continent. I think there's this misconception that for that economic activity to happen, it has to be owned by nationals. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of Africa, there are very many organizations that were sort of public sector based and which didn't have what I would call a focus on performance and efficiency. The public sector or the government was supposed to be a trustee, but somehow people took this opportunity to plunder the assets. And really the advent of privatization is to bring in the entrepreneurship in the management of national resources. And when you're talking about China, or you're talking about India, or you're talking about Brazil coming into Africa, basically you're talking about policies that ensure there's partnership. You're bringing in the skill, you're bringing in the investment into the continent. For example, the development of infrastructure, the extraction of mineral resources, but making sure that there are policies that first of all ensure that these businesses are properly established in the continent, they are paying their taxes, that they are employing the people that they need to be employing in the continent, and that the export proceeds are also benefiting the continent. So I am personally not so hung up on what I would call this local ownership. It's basically bringing in the capacity, as we would see India and China bringing into the continent, to assist us in progressing or accelerating our growth. And really what government needs to do is to be in charge of that process, to ensure that the policies are balanced as we attract that investment, that, for example, the participation of the local population, when you're building roads, that you don't have every single person coming from China, but you engage the local population as well.
Well, we're going to be leaving that discussion there for now. Josphat Mwaura, who's Managing Director at KPMG East Africa, thanks so much for having joined us for the past 30 minutes and sharing your perspective with us. Still with us after the break will be Lullu Krugel, Senior Economist at KPMG, Oti Ikomi, Senior Vice President of Ecobank Transnational, and then Nicolas Maweni, who's a Marketing and Communications Specialist as well. So don't go anywhere. We're back straight after this.